usual thing. So welcome to this webinar. Today we have work on supply chain resilience. As usual, you have 30-40 minutes, it's up to you, for presenting. I will act as a discussant, and then hopefully we'll get also questions from the audience. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for hosting me. Now,
yes.
I have to wait a moment to be in the picture. Sorry for looking like this. It's a bit darkish, but I have a doctoral defense this afternoon, and then you dress up in your black suit and a white shirt because this is obligatory. And it's also a relevant topic. So I just, if you have time left or later on, the defense is quite interesting. It's titled Mission Impossible, Operation Management in Complex, Extreme and Hostile Environments by Nonana Dube. Sorry for the pronunciation of the first name. And it's about disaster relief in mostly sub-Saharan countries and the logistics related to that and operation management activities of humanitarian aid organizations, which I will not address today. As you can see, I'll talk a bit about teams, but before doing that, this whole seminar series, as I interpret it a bit, is about disaster relief. And what we do at FAB is partly on disasters, as I showed a moment ago, but mostly it's on disruptions. And I guess that's a slightly different word, but of course it's a kind of continuum. So we also tend to talk about resilience, organizational resilience or supply chain resilience rather than disaster relief or disaster management. And I guess this goes without saying, we all know that disruptions occur more often and are heavier, and that increasingly organizations, as we study them from Faculty of Economics and Business, need to address these challenges that they are confronted with. And this is a picture that shows how large these disruptions are. These are some examples, partly also from critical infrastructures where we do have some specific projects in. And it says that quite a large amount of companies face large disruptions and increasingly more with a huge impact in terms of the money involved. Resilience then can be understood as the capability to manage and cope with calamities, shocks, disturbances, whatever that might affect business. And the idea of resilience is then to keep performance as good as possible or to recover performance as quickly as possible to the level before the disruption hit in. Just as an example to kind of sketch a little bit the types of environment we are in. So this is an example from over 20 years ago. I actually use it also in a course, which involves Toyota, where one of the parts, a valve, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, a part of one of their suppliers was not delivered anymore because of a fire stop that hit the whole factory, and it would take quite some weeks to restart production, even 6 months for complete recovery, which actually would imply Toyota not to be able to produce any car at all. So you can see that a relatively small disruption has kind of cascading effects, what we often see, of course. What Toyota did is, I think, of course, typical for Toyota, but also typical for the kind of actions we would look into in general. So is there additional inventory? How can we work with our suppliers to collaboratively look for solutions? Is there any flexibility, overcapacity in the chain? Can we come up with new solutions? And actually what you see here is a whole list of activities that Toyota took together with their suppliers to resolve that problem, to enable recovery, as can be shown here. So here you see the kind of typical form also of most disruptions. I would say you see a certain level of performance, then an accident hits in, and either quickly or slowly the effect is seen on the performance. Here actually the output are the number of cars, and then actions are taken to get back to the level of performance that was there before, or even a bit better, to catch up with the production that was lost. I mean, the details are not that important. I think this kind of, I hope, sketched the general idea. This is a recurring. So this is the kind of generalized picture for resilience as being the ability to prevent, detect, respond, and recover from any disruption. And you see the typical stages. So you have a certain level of performance, then something happens, then after some time there might be a drop in performance or not, which is probably preferably if you are kind of resistant to anything you can perform through. Then performance might drop after a disruption. You would like to maintain that drop as small as possible, and then finally the duration of the period is also should be tried to be kept as short as possible, which also offers kind of different performance measures that you could look at with any organization to look at, either the time, the depth, the length, the time to recovery, or whether it happens at all. I'm not a quick learner. To give a little bit of an idea what happens in this field, what you can see is that research so far, and now I'm talking about research in general, and this is a very rough picture with leaving out many interesting details, but there is quite some focus and orientation on larger disruptions. So if you would look for Katrina, you would see a lot of things. If you now search for COVID, you can see a lot of things happening, or quite some papers. So there's quite some attention to that. Most of the material is studied by case studies. Then there is an immense amount of conceptual papers that kind of say this is what resilience is, should be, we define it, redefine it, and so on and so forth. A bit of mathematical modeling, which is always something, a part of our area that likes to do that. What we do in Faculty of Economics and Business is, in arbitrarily order, we work quite a bit with the department organization behavior. Actually, part of what I present today is part of that. Then we like to study, or we embrace the idea that resilience can be very context dependent. So it can depend on the type of disruption or the industry you're in, or other contingencies you might be confronted with as an organization, or maybe even as an individual. There is little that tells us what potential trade-offs are. So whether you should invest more in redundant capabilities or more in flexibility, or whether you should do both or all of that. And a final thing, and I partly address that, is, and I think this is anyhow also a very interesting thing, that most of resilience is looked upon from one organization, whereas partly, as you can see from the Toyota example, part of resilience might come from your suppliers or might be in your distributing things. And so one of the eminent questions would be, how can you organize that in networks or exchange of organizations? And we also try to work a little bit on that. Well, that brings me to the kind of main focus, and maybe I'm too optimistic in what you can present, so we'll see that we don't have to rush too much through it, but I will show you a little bit on work we did with teams and inter-team behavior in supply chains and supply networks. And that's the first part his work with two colleagues from organizational behavior, so that's Tom de Vries and Gerber van der Vecht, and Kirsten Scholten from our department, or from supply chain management operations. And the paper addresses cross-functional teams to ensure robustness. So that's one part of resilience. So one of the things we acknowledge here is that disruptions are kind of inevitable. That's a kind of taken. But happily, sometimes organizations get a warning. But dealing with these warnings is notoriously difficult in a sense. I mean, they are either ignored or it's hard to effectively respond or to take coordinated action as such. So there are many problems. I mean, it might look nice to know what is happening, but you also have to know how to react. So that is part of what we start with. But the idea is often that multifunctional teams are one of the things you should do, or that would be kind of effective in dealing with disruptions, because you kind of shorten lines, you bring things together, there's different expertise, and you're not kind of caught up in one of the organizational silos. So it seems to be ideal, but at the same time, literature acknowledges, and there are several examples, that there is an information overflow. So it means that bringing together people from different disciplines can be an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage. And specifically, if you deal with non-routine events, we do not exactly know where we should go to. So that's the main research question. How do cross-functional team members respond to warnings and try to be robust? So what that means is that to answer that question, we have to kind of dive into how a cross-functional team might be working. And we do that by integrating information processing theory with a more team-oriented theory looking at supply chain disruptions. So, firstly, we define them as signals of unexpected or unwanted change from normal system behavior. Normally, firms have multiple chains, so in any of these chains, warning might exist, which means that, and often these are not clear, so I'll come to that later, but you might get a warning that somewhere a hurricane might happen. Or as today, how should we interpret it that today we have code yellow? So does it mean that it was unsafe to go here by bike or not? I mean, we actually have problems in fully understanding, and also this warning is, of course, uncertain. So in a sense, these kind of warnings are ambiguous in itself. But it also means that if you have different chains and different warnings, you get a kind of competition, and you might have the urgency to feel to make a decision or to do something or not to do something. So this might lead to information overload. What you often see is that in our literature, to say so, or in supply chain management literature, companies would just say, okay, what we do is we build more robustness in, so we have more inventories, so you kind of proactively do things. But again here, to do that, you need coordination between different managers. And as I said, I mean, with more information, more managers, it might be that actually there is some kind of coordination needed. And one of the things you could do then, or one of the things embraced by literature, is something called centralized leadership. So, which I think is, oh no, that's in one of the next slides. So what we take as a more overall lens is organizational information processing theory. The basic tenet of that theory is that if uncertainty increases, there is more need for information processing, and what you need to do is to balance them. It's quite straightforward in a sense, isn't it? And one of the ways to increase your information, information processing capability is cross-functional teams, or as it is called, lateral relationships. And we know also in supply chain management literature that these cross-functional teams help to increase internal integration. However, an important caveat in that theory is that these cross-functional teams are kind of supposedly to work anyhow, independent of how they are structured or how they work together. So it's like it's a bit like the Eilemmer oil, like it's always working as a device to improve things. And actually, it might not be, because teams might have different microdynamics. So this is a very schematic view. You can have a very centralized team or a more decentralized team, one where one member of the team kind of takes the initiative in distributing and coordinating information flows, or one where that's not the case. And that idea we take on board. So we actually say that team decision-making centralization is an important moderator for the effect of disruption warnings. So let's go through this model quickly. I mean, I think it says already what it should say. Quite naturally, the number of supply chain warnings will have an effect on firm robustness. In general, it will decrease the firm robustness. However, and it will lead to internal integration problems. The more warnings you get, the harder it gets to coordinate stuff, which in turn will also affect firm robustness. But that relationship can be kind of dampened by a proper organization of your team processes. So that's the first hypothesis, that relationship is mitigated. It's a bit hard for me to see the full reading. I hope that the audience can see it. So I'm not going to read it because I don't know it by heart. This is my bad preparation, I suppose. And the second one is that internal integration mediates it. So it's a moderated mediation model. Somewhere else. Okay, how did we investigate this? Maybe I'm going to try this one. Maybe it works better. So what we used as the environment to test these hypotheses was a simulation game that we do partly with our own graduate students, partly with professional managers. Both samples kind of complement each other, because of course you would like to test this with real managers, but then it's very hard to experiment with real managers and with real organizations. So this simulation game is a really nice test ground. I'll briefly sketch what it is. It's called the Fresh Connection. And what it is actually you offer teams of students a simulated organization that is in really bad condition. It's actually everything is wrong there in terms of delivery, and the profits are below zero. And the idea is that in a few rounds, this team has to turn back this company to the right track. This is the simple picture of it, so you can kind of recognize a normal supply chain. There is supply, production, distribution, and 4 managers, vice presidents, have each to stir in their own part, but also to coordinate to enable right decision making. Well, I think this doesn't add a lot. During the game, depending a bit on what you do, also some potential disruptions are announced, and depending on what the team has decided in previous rounds or in that current round, these disruptions might hit or not, and as such affect performance, unless, of course, the right mitigation activities were taken. And think of, there are pirate attacks, there is a hurricane, there might be strikes of your personnel because you stress them too much, things like that. It might be quality problems, but there are also other warnings on legal issues that might materialize, but you're never sure. And usually our students are quite optimistic what it means if 25% chance of a hurricane, they say, oh, it's only 25%, but yeah. So this is the one with the professionals, so with quite some teams there. We worked with the organizers of this game actually to do this. And after a number of rounds, we were able to take a survey with them, having all the team members in the survey. So we have teams of 4 and we can ask them all. And so the nice thing is we have kind of objective data from the game and subjective additional data of the whole team, but it's a kind of cross all the team members. So in a sense, it's maybe not perfect, but it's as good as you can get it. So we look at the number of warnings. So that's a kind of coding of the messages that each team has received. And we just counted the number there. We had a simple measure for decision-making centralization. I'll show that in a moment. And we look at firm robustness, so whether or not the return on investment was affected or not. And actually everything in the game kind of collapses, all your decisions on different areas, whether it's sales, it all comes down in the end to your return on investment. So that's a kind of nice measure, and that's also where the competition is all on. So this is the scale we used, quite simple, and we just count that. So that's, I think, a very accepted measure. Coordination, it's just there for sake of completeness. So all of a sudden I'm out of the picture. Didn't say enough, apparently. It also means that, of course, the data structure is somewhat complicated because you have 3 rounds, and of course what people did in the first round, although each round is independent in itself, but of course there is a learning effect and you want to account for that. We controlled for the density of informal leadership, which is one of the, I think, as far as I learned here, is one of the normal things people do in team research. This is the descriptive data. Yeah, I think I'm not going to pay much attention to that. And here you see the model as we did it in the first round. And to enable reading, you can see that indeed there is a significant interaction effect in the red area. And the model is significant, and I think all the models are significant, but I think there's also an increase in explanatory power, so it kind of fits the data quite okay. And here you can also clearly see the interaction effect, so actually suggesting that indeed if you have a more centralized decision-making, then indeed performance is much better than when you have low decision-making. But it also shows the reverse, that actually if the situation is relatively simple, you're better off with not centralized decision-making, as you can see. So you have to kind of accommodate your decision-making structure to a particular situation you're in. The second one we did with our students with more rounds. So, and that also enabled us, of course, with some bonuses and threats to have a survey every round. So we have a much more complete data set. It doesn't sound as a lot, 23, But if you take into account that it's 6 rounds of data collection and each team is at least 4 persons, you can see that the overall amount of data is actually quite impressive, and it's also not that easy to get at. So it's important. I mean, what we do is starting with kind of simple structure of the game, and increasingly more freedom and more uncertainty is entered. So it makes the decision making every round somewhat different, and most of the things are the same. So we again had these pirate attacks and hurricanes and stuff. And we added a scale on internal integration problems. So what related to how easy it was to make decisions and whether there was confusion or not. So this is the thing we used for that. So we work together, understanding, backtracking, the actually normal things to ask. Of course, this is even more complicated. So we have different. I mean, the structure of the data is relatively nested, of course, because each team has members and has several rounds in it. So you have to address that. But what you want is, in the end, of course, to kind of make each decision round as a unit of analysis, in a sense. So we control for that by taking team effects separately from the decision effects. So that's the 2-level model with an autocorrelation function in it to kind of account for the learning effects of these teams. I was happy that I wasn't doing the analysis, but this is what we did. These are the descriptives, and this is the one for the internal integration problems, where you see that, again, the decision-making centralization is indeed a moderator of the effects that we predicted. And this is the more complicated model, where we also look at the mediation. So that's the last red one, the -10, and the other one is again the interaction effect that we wanted to see. So this is way too complicated to see, but as you saw, the paper is accepted, published, so you can read the whole story in detail. So the interaction effects in the figures are similar as earlier. I guess these pictures are kind of clear, and they just confirm what you would like to see in the best possible way, in fact. So what we actually find, of course, is that our main hypotheses were confirmed. It also says that having cross-functional teams is not enough, but you should also kind of take on board that you tune them to the number of disruption warnings, and that centralized decision-making is indeed beneficial if there is an increase in this number. And then the right coordination with these teams is important to achieve what you like, that's being robust or not. So a few things. So far, disruptions have been investigated, but warnings have attracted less. Well, I think it's a very interesting subject in itself. How do you deal with warnings, and can you deal with warnings? The moderating role of decision making. So this is actually the mechanism that could prevent teams from being overwhelmed. It also nuances the role of cross-functional teams. We kind of elaborate the organizational information processing theory because we have this micro-team perspective on it. And we dive a bit more into these team roles. Of course, this is not ideal, partly because it's a simulation game, so people might experience this as a game. At the same time, professional managers do take this quite seriously. We know students also, I mean, they're quite engaged in this game normally, partly because we give them a bonus for good results. But I mean, then time-wise, it doesn't compensate for that, I would say, yeah. But you don't have fully control over everything. I mean, I think from a real psychologist would say, okay, go to the lab and do a better job, or go to real life and do a better job. But I think this is kind of as best as we can get it. But still, I mean, we could add quite some things on team composition, for instance, could be interesting. And actually also to get more into the different types of disruptions. I mean, as you noticed, probably we kind of do the only counting there, which is of course a quite limited thing. What I can do is go through this. I will treat this study slightly shorter and in less detail than the previous one. I'm not sure what time-wise is the best.
Yeah, you still have 10 minutes. So
okay, then I'm perfectly in time, and hope that my speed isn't too fast for people to follow it. So in this study that we did with Mitchell van den Adel, so he just 2 weeks ago he got his PhD, or he defended it and he got it, together with the other supervisor, Tom de Vries. We did a number of studies, actually again focusing, or better said, more focusing on day-to-day disruption. So as you can recall from the example from Toyota, you can see that, well, although burning down a factory is not really a small disruption, but we know that small disruptions might actually kind of, if not paid attention to or not mitigated fast enough, can actually kind of cascade and disrupt the system and evolve into a larger disruption. So what we look here is actually in looking into day-to-day disruptions in a critical infrastructure. It's the Dutch railway system, where different organizations in a network have the task to together solve occurring disruptions. And that's the main thing we look at. Here's a fancy thing. So the example is actually that a relatively small disruption in, and this is a very old known example, that both Nokia and Ericsson dealt differently with that disruption, which basically was the start of Ericsson to lose a lot of money and to be kicked out of the mobile phone market, while Nokia was able to maintain a position. And the idea is that small disruptions can, in the long run, have severe consequences for organizations that are interdependent. So here, again, we look at OIPT, but we say we kind of stretch it to the idea of cross-organizational level or network level. And what we say here is that the capability of different teams from different organizations to work together could be very important to indeed enlarge that information processing capability to enable the right way of interacting and information sharing that would help to solve disruptions in a shorter time. And that's actually depicted in that picture here. Given that in networks, but certainly, of course, in this particular network, coordination and collective countermeasures are important. But again, we think that the type of measures might depend on the situation you're in. So what we say here is that the resilience depends on the first part of specific characteristics of a disruption, whether in this case they co-occur or whether they are kind of novel to the organizations involved. But that's then a right way of cross-boundary information exchange. So this kind of capability that you have to share and exchange information might mitigate these negative effects of these characteristics. So again, this is a kind of contextual model. As I said, we looked at the Dutch railways, where a number of organizations, both the users of the network, but also the people that maintain and help, work together. So it's both the network controller, the users, the different users, and the maintenance providers, which are separate organizations with different departmental teams. But they use a joint platform, and that was the basis for data collection. So every action related to a disruption has to be coded according to fixed standards in that system. We had a month or so of disruptions, in total 277 that we could use, and most of them relate to relatively small things. So it's a small accident, it's a derailed train, it's these things that change from one rail to another that malfunction. There is a tree fallen on the trains, on the tracks, things like that. So what we looked at is time to recovery, which is of course the most important thing both for us as passengers as for anyone in the system, and that's their main thing to look at. We looked at co-occurrence, so that was looking into whether or not during the time of a certain disruption, other disruptions were in the system, being a measure for the kind of overload. The novelty, meaning that we looked at different things there, but basically we looked at whether the people in the system or the people dealing with the problem were known with the type of situation they had to deal with. So we looked at frequency of disruptions because it's related to the location, the way you can approach that location, the quickness, and potential collaboration between different people that are involved in that particular area. So that was the non-routinous. Cross-boundary information, we looked at the number of contacts. And again here, it's somewhat nested because this co-occurrence is, of course, makes actually that you have a kind of clusters of disruptions that are at the same time, and we have to take that into account because they kind of mutually influence each other. So we again have a kind of complicated data structure that we did with something called generalized estimation equations for the ones liking these details, to be able to find good and reliable answers to our hypothesis. So this is so you can see that we also had quite some controls all from this system, and again here, oh no, I can't see the interaction effect, but what we find is indeed a direct effect for disruption co-occurrence, but not for the non-routinous, but we do find effects for both of these direct effects for the interaction with cross-boundary information exchange. That's depicted here. So hypothesis 2, which predicted that there would be a direct effect for non-routinous on disruptions, is not confirmed. So what we say is actually this is, well, not one of the first, but at least one study that looks at day-to-day disruptions in critical infrastructure networks. We find some insights that relate to context, which also means that managers could work with that you really have to look at the overall context rather than only at the dyadic level as we usually do. Of course, this doesn't say there's causality, and of course it might be, the measures, which is of course one of the disadvantages of using archival data, you do not really know what's going on, and you don't see everything happening. We do not know them. And it might also be that this railway, where of course the kind of joint feeling and effort is stronger maybe than in other situations might mean something here. Although, in fact, some of these organizations are competitors in a way. So we could actually try to evolve any of these and also see, because here we mainly focus on collaboration and we ignore other measures that could potentially mitigate or help resilience. So looking at those and at trade-offs could be a next step. And I think that concludes my presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.